It's a strange kind of heartbreak when the person who once begged for your love goes silent, and suddenly you're the one who feels abandoned. The push-pull dynamic between the anxious and the avoidant is one of the most intense emotional patterns in modern relationships. It's not something either person chooses consciously, it's something they fall into. On the surface, it looks like opposites attracting, but underneath, it's often two people trying to resolve emotional wounds through each other. The anxious person craves closeness, connection, and reassurance. They're not needy in a weak way, they just feel more deeply and often more urgently. When they love out loud. They ask questions, initiate conversations, try to fix problems before they become distance. But that very energy, the desire to be emotionally close, can overwhelm the avoidant. To the avoidant, intimacy feels like pressure. Vulnerability feels like exposure. They were often conditioned through early relationships or past heartbreaks to equate closeness with a loss of control or even identity. So when they feel someone getting too close, they back away. Not always physically, but emotionally. They become colder, more distant, less responsive. Now, here's where the dynamic turns into a loop. The anxious partner senses this distance and panics, not because they're irrational, but because their heart was opened. Suddenly, the person they've invested in feels like they're slipping away. So what do? They double down. They text more, they try harder, they become more emotionally expressive. They don't want to lose the connection, so they fight to save it. But from the avoidance perspective, that intensity feels suffocating. So they retreat further. And now the anxious person feels rejected and desperate. They might become angry, frustrated, or more anxious, and the cycle spins faster. What makes this dynamic so painful is that both people are actually longing for love. The anxious wants to feel secure, seen, and prioritized. The avoidant wants to feel accepted without pressure and loved without being smothered. But they don't know how to meet each other where it counts. One reaches in, the other pulls away, and the more one reaches, the more the other retreats. It's an emotional tug of war where no one wins, because the more each person tries to protect themselves, the more they hurt the other. It's important to understand that neither attachment style is wrong. These are protective patterns built from experiences that shaped how someone believes love works. But unless both partners become aware of this dynamic and actively work to heal it, they'll keep triggering each other's fears. The anxious will feel unloved and unimportant. The avoidant will feel overwhelmed and misunderstood. Eventually, resentment builds. The miscommunication turns into mistrust. And even if the love is real, the relationship begins to feel unsafe. And when love starts feeling unsafe, that's when someone walks away. Not because they don't care, but because they can't keep living in emotional limbo. The push-pull dynamic doesn't break when someone changes who they are. It breaks when both people are finally willing to face what they're afraid of and stop dancing around the emotional truth. When the anxious partner finally walks away, it's not a decision made in a moment of anger or impulse. It's the final step in a long, painful process. The world often mislabels the anxious type as clingy, dramatic, or overly emotional. But what most people don't see is the internal war they fight every day just to stay in a relationship that makes them feel invisible. They don't leave because they stopped caring. They leave because they cared too much for too long, and it cost them their peace. An anxious person often enters a relationship with hope. They believe that if they love enough, communicate clearly, and stay patient, the other person will open up. They invest deeply. They notice the little changes in tone, the gaps between replies, the pauses that weren't there before. They sense when energy shifts, and instead of blaming the other person right away, they often blame themselves. What did I do wrong? Am I too much? Maybe if I pull back a little, they'll come closer. They give benefit of the doubt, excuse inconsistencies and rationalize red flags. Why? Because love, to them, feels like a fight worth having. But over time, this emotional labor becomes exhausting. Every unanswered text feels like a rejection. Every cancelled plan feels like confirmation that they're not a priority. They become hyper-aware of every small distance because those distances accumulate into one big truth. I'm giving more than I'm receiving. They try to bring it up gently. They try to create space for honest conversations. Sometimes they even silence their needs, hoping not to scare the other person away. But inside, a slow burn begins. The burn of unmet needs, of feeling like they're begging for basic affection, of trying to explain to someone why they deserve to be chosen. Eventually, something shifts. It might not be a loud argument, it might be something as quiet as sitting next to someone and feeling completely alone, or realizing that they haven't felt safe in the relationship for a very long time. And in that quiet moment, they make the hardest decision of all, to choose themselves. Walking away doesn't feel empowering at first. It feels like grieving a future they fought so hard to protect. It feels like letting go of the hope that the other person would finally change. It feels like mourning not just the relationship, but the version of themselves they became trying to make it work. But underneath the sadness, there's a whisper that says, you deserve to feel loved without constantly having to prove your worth. This is what people misunderstand most about the anxious type. They don't walk away because they're done loving. They walk away because they've reached a point where loving someone else is costing them the ability to love themselves. And once that realization hits, they know staying would hurt more than leaving ever could. When the anxious partner finally walks away, the silence they leave behind doesn't echo immediately. Creeps in slowly. At first, the avoidant might feel a sense of relief. The pressure is gone. The constant questioning, the emotional conversations, the need for closeness, they all stop. And for someone who equates vulnerability with discomfort, that silence can feel like peace for a moment, but silence has a way of getting louder with time, especially when it comes from the one person who made the most noise in your life. The one who always checked in, always reached out, always cared enough to fight for the connection. The avoidant may not notice it right away, but the absence of the anxious partner begins to strip away the distractions. No more texts waiting for a reply, no more soft reminders of emotional needs, no more invitations to connect. It's just them now. And without realizing it, the very things they once found overwhelming start to feel like something else entirely. Emptiness. Because the anxious partner, for all their intensity, brought warmth. They brought attention, care, a steady stream of love that filled the quiet spaces. And now those spaces are cold. The avoidant may try to justify the distance at first. It's better this way, I needed space, they were too emotional. But those thoughts only work when there's someone else still on the other end of the line, still texting, still calling, still trying. When that stops, a new kind of discomfort sets in, a confrontation with solitude, not the kind that feels empowering, but the kind that exposes what they've avoided all along. They begin to miss the comfort of being loved without having to ask for it. They miss being needed, being pursued, being forgiven so easily. They remember how the anxious partner showed up even after being pushed away, and now no one is showing up at all. This realization often arrives too late, because the avoidant was used to love being something they could keep at arm's length. They didn't have to fully receive it because the anxious person was always reaching. But once that effort stops, once the anxious partner finally chooses their own well-being over waiting, the avoidant faces the cost of their emotional distance, not in theory, in reality, in the quiet apartment, in the untouched messages, in the way their world feels a little less alive without someone pulling them out of their shell. And what's more painful is that they don't always know how to fix it. Reaching out now would require vulnerability, the very thing they spent the entire relationship avoiding. It would mean taking responsibility, admitting that fear, not indifference, kept them from connecting. But avoidance doesn't prepare you for repair, it prepares you for retreat. And so they sit in the very silence they once craved, only now it feels different, not peaceful, not free, just hollow. Because what they feared all along wasn't being close, it was being alone. And now that fear is real. Love, at its core, is not something that should be begged for, chased after, or negotiated into existence. It's a choice, an active daily decision between two people who both want to be there. But for someone with an anxious attachment style, love can often feel like a pursuit. They're conditioned to believe that if they just try harder, love will stay. If they're more available, more understanding, more patient, then the other person will eventually reciprocate in the way they hope for. And when the avoidant partner continues to hold back, withdraw, or deflect emotional intimacy, the anxious person feels compelled to overcompensate. They believe that love is earned through effort. But love that's real, love that's stable and lasting, is never one-sided. It's not about chasing, it's about being met. Chasing someone who avoids emotional connection is a painful experience. It creates a power imbalance where one person becomes the constant giver and the other the passive receiver. The anxious partner feels like always waiting for text, waiting for clarity, waiting to be chosen fully, and that wait starts to feel endless. There's no emotional safety in a relationship where one person is always wondering where they stand. That uncertainty doesn't build love, it erodes self-worth. And yet, because of the emotional highs and lows, it can feel addictive. One moment of affection can erase weeks of neglect. One glimpse of closeness makes the anxious partner think, see, it's still there. But love isn't real if it only shows up when the other person feels safe enough or pressured enough to offer it. It has to be present even when things aren't convenient. A relationship built on the foundation of one person doing the emotional lifting will never be sustainable. Because eventually, the one who chases burns out. They wake up one day and realize they're exhausted. Not from loving, but from trying to convince someone that their love is worth choosing. The anxious partner might have given their best patience, understanding, presence, but if the other person isn't willing to engage, it becomes a cycle of emotional starvation. You can't keep pouring into someone who refuses to hold the cup. And when that realization comes, it doesn't always come with anger. Sometimes it comes with sadness, with grief, with the quiet understanding that no amount of effort can force someone to be emotionally available. True love begins when two people choose each other freely, not out of fear, not out of habit, but out of a genuine desire to build something together. It looks like showing up when it's hard. It means communicating even when it's uncomfortable. It means meeting halfway, not always expecting the other to come the full distance. Love isn't about pushing past someone's walls. It's about choosing someone who's willing to take their walls down with you. Because no matter how much you care, no matter how much you try, you can't teach someone to value connection if they're committed to avoiding it. When distance happens in a relationship, whether it's a temporary pause or a permanent break, it creates space. And space has a way of revealing things that closeness often conceals. When two people are caught in the anxious-avoidant dynamic, their interactions are full of reaction rather than reflection. The anxious partner is reacting to the emotional distance, and the avoidant is reacting to the perceived emotional intensity. There's little room for self-awareness because both people are caught in survival mode, trying to either hold on or pull away. But when one person finally steps back, especially the anxious partner who's been holding things together, that dynamic breaks. And in that break, both people are left alone with the one thing they've been avoiding, themselves. For the anxious partner, the separation can feel like a collapse at first. everything they feared, abandonment, rejection, being unchosen, seems to come true. But then something else starts to emerge. In the silence, they begin to see how much they were giving without receiving. They start to notice how many times they compromised their own needs just to keep the peace. How often they explained themselves, justified their emotions, tried to fix something they didn't break. And slowly they begin to realize that the relationship wasn't feeding them, it was draining them. That clarity doesn't come from another conversation or another attempt to fix things. It comes from the stillness of being apart, where there's finally room to hear their own voice again. For the avoidant partner, the healing process often looks different. In the absence of the anxious partner's consistent effort, there's a noticeable shift. There's no one chasing, no one smoothing over emotional tension, no one filling the silence. At first, they might tell themselves they're better off, free from emotional demand. But eventually, that quiet starts to feel unsettling. They begin to miss the comfort of being emotionally cared for without having to ask. They remember how it felt to be loved so fully, so patiently, and how they took that presence for granted. And for the first time, they are forced to look at why they were pushing it away. The avoidance was never about not caring. It was about fear. Fear of being seen too deeply, fear of needing someone, fear of not being enough. This distance, as painful as it can be, is often the only thing that breaks the pattern. Because when two people are constantly reacting to each other, there's no room for growth. But when they're apart, the mirror turns inward. They begin to examine not just what the other person did or didn't do, but how their own wounds shaped their responses. Healing begins not when someone comes back to apologize or when closure is handed over in a perfect sentence, but when the emotional noise quiets and both people finally sit with their own truth. The anxious begins to find peace in self-worth, and the avoidant starts to feel the weight of emotional absence as something more than just space. It becomes a mirror, and mirrors don't lie. When someone with an anxious attachment walks away from a relationship, it's rarely about making the other person suffer or miss them. It's not a tactic, not a manipulation, and certainly not a power play. It's a deeply personal decision rooted in a quiet but powerful shift. The moment they begin to remember their worth. For so long, the anxious person stays. They stay in conversations that go in circles. They stay in patterns where they're always reaching, always trying, always hoping. They stay in situations where their emotional needs are minimized or labeled as too much. They adapt, they accommodate, they shrink themselves just to keep the connection alive. But over time, that survival strategy becomes self-neglect, and it takes a toll. Eventually, they start to notice the ache beneath their hope. They realize that their efforts aren't bringing them closer to the other person, they're just making them feel smaller. It doesn't happen all at once. Often it comes in waves. Disappointment that doesn't go away. Exhaustion that sleep can't fix. Loneliness that sits in their chest even when they're not alone. They might try one last time to explain what they need, hoping the other person will finally understand. But when that plea is met with silence, defensiveness, or withdrawal, something inside them begins to shift. It's not rage. It's not even sadness. It's clarity. The kind that quietly says, I can't do this to myself anymore. That's the moment where empowerment begins, because up until that point, they've been loving someone else more than they've been protecting themselves. They've confused endurance with strength. But walking away, truly walking away, isn't weakness, it's courage. It's the decision to stop auditioning for a role they should have already been given, the role of someone's priority. And that decision doesn't require the other person to change, apologize, or finally understand. It only requires one thing: self-respect. What's often misunderstood is that the walk away isn't about making someone miss you. That might happen. In fact, it often does. But that's not the goal. The goal is peace. It's the relief of not constantly wondering where you stand. It's the calm that comes from no longer chasing clarity in someone who's always running from depth. When you walk away with self-worth, you're not trying to provoke regret. You're reclaiming your energy. You're no longer available for half-hearted effort, mixed signals, or breadcrumb affection. You're choosing presence, honesty, and emotional safety. And yes, it might hurt. You might still love them. You might still want to be loved by them. But self-worth doesn't mean you stop feeling. It means you stop abandoning yourself in the name of being loved by someone else. You begin to ask new questions, not how do I get them back, but why did I ever believe this was all I deserved? And in answering that question, you start to rebuild, not the relationship, but yourself. Because real healing begins not when they miss you, but when you no longer miss the version of you who accepted less than what you truly need. So if you're sitting there wondering why it hurts so much to let go of someone who couldn't fully love you, remind yourself of this. It hurt because you showed up. It hurt because you loved deeply, and that's nothing to be ashamed of. There's something to be proud of. But loving deeply doesn't mean you're meant to bleed for it. You were not put here to chase, to prove, to beg, or to wait for someone to realize your worth only when you're gone. Whether you were the anxious heart that kept giving or the avoidant soul that kept retreating, this isn't about blame. It's about awareness, about healing, about recognizing that real love doesn't feel like anxiety. It doesn't leave you guessing. It doesn't make you doubt your voice or silence your needs. Real love meets you where you are. It looks you in the eyes and says, I'm here, I choose you. Not just when it's easy, but when it's real. So maybe today is the day you stop calling it love when it's really just survival. Maybe today is the day you walk, not away from them, but back to yourself, to your peace, to your clarity, to the version of you that doesn't have to beg to be chosen. Because the right person, you won't have to chase them, you'll just meet them and they'll stay. Not out of guilt, not out of fear, but because they see you, because they're ready, because love, when it's right, doesn't run. And neither should you.